We've heard a lot of very compelling, very interesting perspectives on the topic of refugees and migration. I feel that a lot of them have focused on the response or the lack thereof, and specifically on US and EU policy in dealing with the refugee flows that we're seeing today. What I would like to do right now is to take a step back from what we've been talking about so far, and to consider a story, a part of this story that hasn't been told yet. It's been touched upon, but it hasn't really been explored any further. So I'd like you all to take this step back with me, and for us all of us to look at the wider displacement picture. There's a sense in which the crisis that we're seeing today, and the refugee arrivals that we've seen in Europe, are very much the end point of a crisis rather than a starting point. They're actually the symptom of something that started somewhere else. So what I'd like to do right now is consider where these journeys started and who these people are actually that we're talking about, and consider what happened before they made it onto our TV screens and before they made it to Europe and the US and Australia. So my presentation is going to be focusing on a group of people that we haven't talked about much, internally displaced persons, or IDPs as they're also called. I'll be focusing on three main points, or I'll be making, my presentation will be organized around three main parts. One, I'll be presenting the scope and the scale of internal displacement in the world today. Why am I doing that? I think it's important to look at that because I'd like to underline the striking disparity between the reality of internal displacement on the ground and the relative lack of attention and response towards IDPs. Then the second part of my presentation will be sort of trying to answer the so what question. Why should we care more about internal displacement, both as a starting point for many of these onward cross-border movements that we're seeing today, but also as a cause and a consequence of wider crisis and fragility. And then thirdly, I'll be sharing some thoughts on what is needed moving forward. Just a spoiler alert, I don't actually have a solution. I don't have any brilliant answers, but hopefully they'll be a little bit more sophisticated than build a wall and stop the boats. So bear with me. First slide, please. I thought it would be useful to just go over the definition of an IDP. An IDP is a person who's been forced to flee their home as a result of armed conflict, generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural and human-made disasters, but who have not crossed an internationally recognized border. This is the definition from the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement from 1998. Now, there are two elements in this definition that are very important. One is the forced element. We're talking about people who don't choose to leave their homes, but who are forced to do so. And we're not just looking at conflict context, but we're looking at all causes of movement, of forced movement. And then the second very important element of this definition is what I've underlined, is the notion of not having crossed an internationally recognized border. Why is that important? It's important because it means that IDPs don't benefit from an international protection framework because they fall under the jurisdiction of their state. So their states are responsible for their protection and for their assistance. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem because in many contexts, what we're seeing is that displacement, internal displacement takes place in countries where often the state is responsible for having caused the displacement in the first place. So finding solutions to this displacement and providing adequate protection and assistance is very challenging. Obviously, issues of sovereignty mean that accessing IDPs in certain contexts is very difficult. I mean, all I need to do is say the word Syria, and you can imagine what I'm talking about. So let's have a look at the global scale of this problem. This is the maybe I should actually mention that I work for an organization in Geneva that's responsible for compiling statistics on IDPs across the world. So we publish global statistics on an annual basis. And this is the map that we published in 2016. So this is covering the year 2015, and unfortunately we're still compiling the figures for 2016, so I'm having to present the figures for last year. But basically what this map shows is that internal displacement is a global phenomenon. Over 27 million people were displaced over the course of 1 year between the 1st of January 2015 and the 31st of December 2015. Now that is the equivalent of the populations of New York City, London, Paris, and Cairo combined. The regions most affected by conflict-related displacement, as you can see in orange, are the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. The regions most affected by disaster-related displacement, as you can see, are South and East Asia. I thought it would be useful also to have a look at the trends of conflict-related IDPs versus refugees over the last few years. And what you can see here is that in 2015, we reported 40.8 million conflict IDPs currently in the world, which is twice the number of refugees. So it means that 2/3 of the frequently cited figure of 65 million people displaced by conflict are actually internally displaced. This is an infographic that I like. It was published in The Economist a year ago, I think. So don't pay too much attention to the figures because they're out of date. But I like this infographic because it provides a snapshot using the Syria example of these different caseloads and these different groups of people. And as you can see in the Syria example, I mean, the infographic was put together mostly to illustrate the lack of response really from European countries relative to countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. But what it also illustrates is the relative scale of IDPs compared to refugees. And those IDPs, who are now no longer 7.6 million, but more around 6.5 million, because a lot of them have since crossed the border and left the country, but nevertheless, we're looking at a massive caseload compared to the refugee caseload. So in 2015, the countries most affected by conflict-related internal displacement were, unsurprisingly, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. But Sub-Saharan Africa was also affected, as it is every year. Some of the countries worst affected in Africa are Sudan, South Sudan, Nigeria, and DRC. This is a picture of Yemeni children in Sana'a, IDPs. Yemen was very badly affected by internal displacement in 2015 because that's when the conflict escalated. So we recorded 2.2 million new internal displacements that year. Same in Iraq, 1.1 million IDPs in 2015, fleeing the rise of ISIS and other non-state armed groups. DRC, we're looking now at approximately 2 million IDPs in eastern Congo, and with new displacements every year. And then finally, another just picture of Nigeria, because Nigeria is also one of the biggest IDP caseloads in Africa. In 2015, there were 700,000 new displacements by conflict, along with 100,000 additional people displaced by floods. The total number of IDPs currently in Nigeria is about 1.7 million. My organization, IDMC, tracks people internally displaced by conflict, but also people displaced by sudden onset disasters. The figures, the numbers of people displaced each year by disasters are absolutely staggering. Since 2008, we've recorded over 200 million displacements. You can see that most of these displacements are caused by biggest events, massive what we call mega events, like, for example, Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, Hurricane Sandy was quite big in 2012, And of course, we will be reporting probably very sad figures again with Hurricane Matthew in October last year. Generally, the countries most affected by disaster displacement each year are China, India, and the Philippines. But in 2015, Nepal actually made it into the top 3 countries worst affected, with the 2 major earthquakes that hit the country in April and May 2015 and that displaced more than 2.6 million people. Now, months after the earthquake, there were still thousands of people who were displaced, who hadn't found a solution, and still today, with a country's overall weak capacity to respond, and given the substantial damage to their homes, there's still a significant number of people who remain displaced. Another example from 2015 was also sadly in Africa, in Malawi, where 330,000 people were displaced by seasonal floods in January. And today we still have an undetermined number, still seeking land for permanent resettlement, and concerns that with agricultural drought in southern Africa, which has led to some severe food shortages, that more displacement could happen in the future. Now, on top of the situations and the context that I've just referred to, there are also a number of other causes of displacement in the world. One of them is linked to slow onset disasters such as drought, desertification, sea level rise, processes of environmental degradation that are very hard to link to displacement, because the displacement that results from these processes is, of course, multi-causal. It's not a direct relationship between drought and displacement, but it's obvious that in the case of drought, we're looking at a gradual erosion of people's livelihoods, which pushes them to a point where it's no longer viable to stay in their place of habitual residence, which means that they have no other choice but to leave. So we're trying to monitor drought-related displacement across the world, but it's very difficult. We don't have any global figures for that phenomenon, but just to give you an idea, we did report on drought-related displacement in Ethiopia in 2015 that pointed to about 280,000 people displaced in the course of only 8 months. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, the regions of the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, but also India last year are of huge concern to us. Another cause of internal displacement across the world, and this is probably one of the most substantial, and that for which we still don't have global statistics, but we assume that they're going to be worse than all the others that we have, are the millions of people that are displaced each year by development projects across the world. People who are forcibly evicted from their homes to make way for major infrastructure, road construction, urban renewal, even the Olympic Games in Rio and sporting events across the world. The World Bank has compiled its own statistics and showed that about 20 million people per year were displaced alone just from World Bank projects. So, second point of my presentation is, why is all of this important? Why should we care about internal displacement? At IDMC, we were quite disappointed that internal displacement wasn't included in the New York discussions that Karen talked about this morning, that bureaucratic nightmare. For us, the nightmare came from the fact that IDPs were actually excluded from the conversation. Of course, some states tried to push for their inclusion, but in general, there was total resistance to the idea of including them, again, because it would require touching on state sovereignty. So we've been racking our brains to come up with the most compelling arguments for policymakers to actually shift their attention, not completely away from refugees and migrants, of course, but certainly to reorient somewhat their attention to IDPs. And we think that probably the most compelling argument at this point in time, sadly, is to demonstrate that unresolved internal displacement requires more attention precisely because it has a number of knock-on effects and consequences. one of the obvious knock-on effects of unresolved internal displacement is obviously onward and cross-border movement. Protracted and unresolved internal displacement actually forces people to seek protection and assistance elsewhere. But then, as we have seen, that just shifts the problem onto other countries. And it puts a huge strain on the resources of host countries. But more generally, I think the argument, the most important argument that has to be made here is that unresolved internal displacement creates a vicious cycle of crisis and vulnerability, and it lays down the conditions for future crisis and for more displacement. So let's unpack a little bit this relationship between internal and external displacement, or between internal and cross-border movement. Actually, wait a second before I get to this. I'd like to refer to Chaloka Beyani's words. Chaloka Beyani is the previous UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs, who actually said in one of his speeches that today's IDPs are tomorrow's refugees. Now, of course, this statement has held true in some places in the world, perhaps not in every. It's not a statement that we can apply blankly across all the displacement situations that we know, but just looking at Syria, it seems clear that, I think it was Gerald who showed a slide this morning, and that showed that there was a tipping point at which people started fleeing Syria. Before that, they were actually displaced within the country. So clearly, the failure to protect in country is one of the key drivers of that onward movement. There was recently a survey done by UNHCR, I believe, of Syrian and Afghan refugees arriving in Greece that showed that 85% of them had been IDPs before arriving in Greece, before becoming refugees. In 2015, 7 out of the top 10 countries producing refugees were also in the world's top 10 countries with the largest numbers of IDPs. That's Afghanistan, Colombia, DRC, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Syria. This is just zooming in on Africa, which also illustrates the same point of internal and cross-border displacement patterns that also show that the countries with the highest numbers of IDPs are also refugee-producing countries. Just to give a few examples of those of that relationship. If we look at regional dynamics in the Lake Chad Basin with the Boko Haram armed group operating across Nigeria, but also Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, we're also looking at significant numbers of IDPs in Nigeria, but also quite a few refugees across the region. We're now also looking at a significant number of South Sudanese refugees arriving in Uganda, but who also started their journey as IDPs in South Sudan, in their own country, before making that choice to leave. There are also some interesting patterns of internal to cross-border movement. If we look at, for example, the DRC, it's a country that I know well because I worked and lived there for several years. You have some really interesting choices that people are forced to make. People who are displaced who stay at night in host communities, but who travel during the day to another place to go and plow their fields to make a living. The same can happen across a border, especially when you're living in the east next to a border. It's very easy to kind of straddle that border. We're also now seeing, I think it was Bruno just now who made those points, a clear relationship between internal and cross-border movements when we consider these refugees from Dadaab being returned back to Somalia. Same for Afghan refugees, or even Central American refugees from the Northern Triangle, who, if they get pushed back into their countries, are not likely to go back to their original place of residence, but who will become IDPs again. So I don't want to say that there's some kind of inevitability to IDPs crossing borders, but let's not forget the numbers that we've seen today. And I think we need to acknowledge that the majority of people today don't have the choice. They don't have that And I don't want to call it a luxury because it's not a luxury, but many of these people that we're seeing today actually are displaced within the borders of their country and are not crossing borders. More broadly, I'd just like to talk about the second point that I wanted to make, moving beyond the relationship between internal and cross-border displacement. I'd like to make the point that unresolved, not caring about internal displacement or not resolving internal displacement leads to a vicious cycle of crisis. Internal displacement is the symptom of underlying structural factors that combine to allow a crisis to erupt. This is an infographic that we produced to illustrate displacement by Boko Haram in Nigeria, but it actually applies to many of the other contexts that we've been working on. Some of the underlying structural drivers at play here are political, linked to a country's fragility, political instability, weak governance, corruption. They're also economic. We're looking at underdevelopment or uneven development, unemployment. They're environmental, countries' exposure to natural hazards, whether they're floods, storms, or drought, and demographic, high population growth, urbanization. Some of the work that we've done on global disaster-related displacement shows that the risk of becoming displaced by a disaster has actually doubled over the last 40 years, mostly due to demographic growth, rapid urbanization, and economic growth. And obviously, in the case of Nigeria, you can see that all those factors are at play. They combine, they accumulate to give rise to a phenomenon like Boko Haram, and they push people to leave. And those people at the top who become displaced and who are not protected and not assisted, they feed back. It's a negative feedback loop that feeds back into that vicious cycle and that perpetuates displacement risk. So these structural problems, they're the same factors that are at the root of the intractability and the protractedness of many of the internal displacement situations that we're seeing today. So just to qualify that a little bit, nowadays it's actually rare to find an internal displacement situation that gets resolved within less than a year. It just doesn't happen. Protracted displacement is actually pretty much the norm. And the obstacles to finding solutions are often the same as those that caused the original displacement in the first place. So whether it's conflict or disasters, displacement can last sometimes for decades. So we've actually broken the myth through our analysis that disaster-related displacement is short-lived, because it's not true. It goes on for a long time. All you need to look at, even here in the US, the effects of Katrina, the effects of Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey, where a number, not a significant, but a number of people still today have not found sustainable housing solutions and are still technically displaced years after the event. What's interesting to look at here when we look at chronic displacement in some cases is just taking these 5 African countries, you can see that those countries that have the highest or the biggest IDP caseloads are also those that are repeatedly hit by new displacement every year. So what is the impact of all of this? We need to ask ourselves, what is the impact of this type of repeated shock onto the system? The impact on people, on communities, but also on entire countries and economies. If I just take the example of DRC, which I know quite well, I can tell you that the impacts, the human impacts of displacement are multiple. They affect people from their own physical safety to how they break their social networks, how they affect family dynamics within a family, they disrupt children's education. And I think we mentioned it yesterday, the mental health impacts of this type of displacement are not to be underestimated. So the ability of communities and countries to cope is really compromised. If you think about drops in agricultural production, generations of school dropouts, it means that development itself is undermined, it's suspended, it's delayed. So if that's not a compelling argument for caring about internal displacement, I don't know what is. So, where do we go from here? Like I said, I don't have all the answers, but I do think that understanding patterns of internal displacement basically amounts to understanding some of the root causes of crisis and fragility. And it also amounts to refocusing political investment and financial resources to where they're needed, i.e. at the heart of the problem. So I think we need to convince policymakers that there is a link between internal displacement and larger refugee and migration flows. That would already be a good starting point. I think we need more evidence about this link. I think the evidence right now is still quite piecemeal. We can't say for sure that all IDPs will become refugees. Maybe we can say with a little bit more certainty that refugees were previously IDPs, but better understanding that link and the tipping points between internal and the point at which in a crisis a person has no other choice but to flee, I think is key. And then I think we need simultaneous rather than sequential investment into the different phases of displacement. It's no longer, I think it's clear, I hope it's clear from my presentation that internal displacement isn't just a humanitarian issue. It's far more than a humanitarian issue. It's a political issue and it's a development issue. So it needs to be addressed and treated as such, and it needs to mobilize a broad range of actors, from the humanitarians to people working on prevention, disaster risk reduction, early recovery, development. So it requires a multidisciplinary and a multi-mandate approach. I'd like to finish with this slide, which is a kind of a reminder of the policy frameworks right now that are out there, the global policy frameworks. The global policy frameworks that range from disaster risk reduction with Sendai, sustainable development with the SDGs, humanitarian action with the outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit, climate change with our landmark Paris Agreement on climate change, and the Platform on Disaster Displacement. All of these policy frameworks actually recognize displacement as a cross-cutting and a key issue. So we need to build on this. These frameworks exist, these commitments have been made. They're not always well tied together. They're still quite siloed, but there is an opportunity there, and that opportunity needs to be grabbed. But again, as we've said throughout the day, nothing will happen without political will and without political leadership. So it's now time to turn these commitments into action and to make sure that no one is left behind. Thank you.